Vantor, delivering sovereign spatial intelligence that gives nations the ground truth.
Hello and welcome back. Before we get to matters of substance, I switched on the TV on Sunday while I was doing some domestic chores and had the misfortune to discover that our national broadcaster, the ABC, had decided to televise live US President Donald Trump's speech to mark the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. I find this sort of stuff just abject cultural cringe, but I suppose it was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and for ABC programmers, it's easier just to run this sort of stuff unedited for a couple of hours than it is to actually make a news program. Anyway, regular listeners will know I'm not a particular fan of the second term of the US president, which I think is doing untold damage to the US itself and to alliances around the world, including potentially Australia's. Let me say that the 10-minute section that I forced myself to watch would have done Joseph Goebbels proud, with a Nuremberg-style rally, with Trump shouting that the US was the greatest country that had ever been created and basically could do whatever it wanted because of its military strength. People in the crowd were chanting USA, USA, that sort of stuff. At one point, in discussing a historic flag, a prop on stage, he said, and this is a direct quote, "It flew atop our flagship after America's Navy sank the Spanish fleet to the bottom of Manila Bay, one of the greatest naval victories in history." No, it wasn't at all. It was largely insignificant. If you want naval battles, think Salamis when the Greeks took on the Persians, or Trafalgar, or Jutland. Or if you wanted a naval victory that the US can take credit for, then the Battle of Midway was hugely important in the Second World War when US carriers defeated a Japanese fleet. And you can add to that the Battle of the Coral Sea, a bit closer to home, which prevented a Japanese amphibious landing at Port Moresby. If that had occurred successfully, it would have been a military disaster. Anyway, President Trump, a notorious 5-time draft dodger himself, seems to genuinely enjoy using the US military to inflict death and destruction on anyone, any country he wants. For example, the completely unnecessary war in the Middle East that he and Israel started on the 28th of February, and which might flare up again at any moment. Anyway, getting back to Manila and the Spanish ships, that appeared to trigger the further thought. He added, "Much like our recent victories sinking the entire Iranian Navy, 159 ships to the bottom of the sea, all done in just a moment's time. We have the greatest military anywhere in the world." Well, indeed, for the moment, the US does have the greatest military in the world, because this is what happens when you spend as much on defence as the next 10 countries combined. And those 159 Iranian ships, most of them were defenceless speedboats. Oh, and by the way, earlier on the same day, July 4th, obviously, he had a 90-minute phone chat with his good pal Vladimir Putin. I wonder what that was about. And now this is a very uncharitable and petty thought from me, and I usually don't care one way or the other about sporting events, but I hope that the US does not win the Soccer World Cup, because if that happens, Donald Trump will claim personal credit for the victory, and this will make his sense of triumphalism even worse than it is. Anyway, back to sanity and a few developments in Australia worth noting. There was an important speech by Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy on the 2nd of July. It hasn't received much media coverage, and what did get attention were what I thought were strange comments about Robert Menzies being a Nazi appeaser back in 1939. Now, the minister is smart enough to have known that this would get some attention, certainly from the Conservative press and the coalition, and I'm not sure why he made those comments, because they were a distraction from the main theme of his speech, which was about strengthening Australian industry, well, allegedly strengthening industry, and reforming defence procurement. So I'm really not sure why the minister is trying to turn defence into a party political thing. You know, Labour good, coalition bad, Curtin hero, Menzies villain, because I don't see how that helps anyone. And as I've done my best to explain, there's a history of incompetence that spans multiple governments. Now, I'm always interested in history, as people know, but whether or not Menzies was a Nazi appeaser, there's a little bit of evidence either way, that isn't particularly relevant today. And I will also just add that in the late 1930s, there were a lot of people in the Western world who still were not taking Adolf Hitler seriously, and also who completely ignored the Japanese threat in the Pacific region and China. Now, I'll analyse these defence reforms in detail in writing, but as previously mentioned, they centre on things such as the creation of a defence procurement agency and the selection of a national armaments director. On paper, some of the measures look like they make sense, though I don't necessarily agree with the government's rhetoric that these are the most significant reforms to defence in the last 50 years. That's just a bit of window dressing, I think. Leaving that aside, what troubles me, and I've said this before, is you can change an organisation as much as you want, but if the people in it and their attitudes remain the same, you will achieve very little. Now, Minister Conroy's remarks, not just at the press club, but I think during a media interview the night before, have received a bit of attention because he said that an internal defence review had found that a minimum of $29 billion has been wasted. I think it's, sort of over a 10-year period, mainly because of bureaucratic bungling, requirements creep, very poor and slow decision-making, all of that sort of stuff. What I and various others wonder is why has no one ever been held to account for this huge amount of waste? And let's be clear, it isn't fraud, it's just incompetence. To be fair, the minister said the problem is with the defence system, not the individuals within it, most of whom are, in fact, hard-working and dedicated. However, I think it's actually a bit of a mix, and if you want to see real change, and change that happens fast, well, sack, or at least demote, a couple of utterly incompetent project managers, because unfortunately there are indeed a few of those to choose from. In countries like South Korea, they throw them in jail. The Koreans take the very sensible view that if somebody through stupidity or negligence has wasted large amounts of taxpayers' money, they are responsible and they should be held to account. Instead, in Australia, even the most enthusiastic and dedicated person in the defence ecosystem observes that no matter how incompetent others are, they will always be promoted no matter what. I imagine that is completely demotivating. Well, in fact, I know it is, particularly when uniformed people see an utterly unperforming colleague promoted ahead of them because they have been sucking up to the commanding officer. And this sort of stuff happens quite frequently. In the public service, there is a system of salary bonuses. They are, to the best of my knowledge, usually quite modest. If we're talking about sort of middle-level people, maybe 5 to 10% of their salaries. But I have seen these bonuses consistently misused. Rather than going to people as a reward for good performance, the opposite is often the case, and they are taken off people as a way of punishing them, usually for petty personal grievance issues. Oh, by the way, I'm about to read out a quote from October 2022, and I would like everyone to guess who said these words. Are you ready? This is the quote. In short, we are going to actively manage defence procurement after a lost decade of negligence on the part of the former government. And I want to be clear on one point. This is not the fault of the Department of Defence. This is not the fault of Australian defence industry. They are fantastic and do a wonderful job in serving the national interest. What we have seen is a complete failure of leadership by the former coalition, and we intend to rectify that. We are going to manage defence spending in a way which achieves value for money for taxpayers. We're going to manage defence procurement in a way which is going to keep Australians safe. Now, if you guess Defence Minister Richard Marles spoke those harsh words, you would be correct. He said this at a joint media conference with Pat Conroy, who was nodding along in agreement with everything that he said. To paraphrase, not the fault of the system, it's all the fault of the ministers. Well, the government has changed its tune on that one. But again, I'm going to be fair to Pat Conroy. He did, when asked the question, did he take responsibility? He was brave enough to say, yes, he did. So at least I am hoping that his heart is in the right place when it comes to reforming defence. Anyway, for what it's worth, my question to the Minister at the Press Club address, you can watch it on ABC iView if you like, it's all there. My question was, well, I pointed out that defence spending in 1983-84 was 2.6%. That would have been the first Labor Defence Minister Gordon Scholes, followed by Kim Beazley. In 1984-85, 2.6%, and 86-87, also 2.6%. If we jump forward, I won't do every year, to Robert Ray, in 91-92, defence budget 2.3% of GDP, 94-95, 2.4% of GDP. I'll remind everyone that in this financial year we are at 2.02%, with a slow growth path to 2.3% in the 2030s. This is not a massive ramp-up. Anyway, the minister argued back that it was, and he said, we're spending unprecedented amounts of cash. That is true, but as I've discussed before, that's simply a byproduct of this thing called inflation. Every year, defence budgets go up just because of that process. It's not a magical achievement. And also, in the last podcast, I read out a list of countries that are genuinely ramping up. Spain, a 49% year-on-year increase in defence spending. Germany, a 28% year-on-year increase in defence spending. Canada, from memory, 22%, all of that sort of stuff. The previous, as I say, we are going backwards in this financial year, and last financial year, it was a miserable 3% increase year-on-year. This ain't the massive build-up that the government keeps on insisting that it is. Now, some submarine stuff. We all love submarines, and I've got a fair bit of stuff to go through, so I'll canter through some of these things, but we'll try and elaborate in a future podcast. First, I noticed that when Defence Minister Richard Marles was speaking at an Australian Strategic Policy Institute conference here in Canberra, he justified the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines by saying that Australia is a three-ocean navy. Well, yes, we are. I wasn't aware of any particular threats that might originate from Antarctica or the Heard and McDonald Islands, but also I have to accept that they are relevant. You can think of some scenarios where you might want to operate submarines down that way. I don't think it would be a very high priority, but there you go. Anyway, like a lot of AUKUS boosters, and I'm going to elaborate on this, people seem to be relying on just the most simplistic and at times silly arguments. None of the people who are critical of AUKUS, including me, deny that we don't need a navy. Everyone accepts that. Again, because of, this three-ocean thing, but it's trying to understand where nuclear-powered submarines fit into that equation, particularly given the gigantic amounts of money that we're forking out for them. You could actually effectively ring-fence Australia out to a distance of something like 5,000 kilometres using modern air-independent diesel-electric submarines. I'll definitely be elaborating on that in the future because battery technology is really racing along. Anyway, the media also picked up on a quote from a Labour Senator, Raf Ciccone. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I haven't met him personally. He had some things to say during an adjournment debate, which were characterised by a couple of journalists as a blistering attack on AUKUS critics. Well, I've dished out a few blistering attacks myself, and I've been on the receiving end of some, so I know what they are, and let me assure you, this was no blistering attack. This was just a repetition of the same nonsense that we've been fed for the last 4 years. Now, Senator Ciccone is an up-and-comer who chairs the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security. He's been doing that since October 2024. He has a relatively high profile, and I suspect he's got a bright political future in front of him. Anyway, he sought to attack the review that Peter Garrett and others are conducting. I've mentioned that previously. And they are, I would not be surprised if they came up with a rather sceptical report about AUKUS. This is already terrifying the government, and so they're wheeling out people like Senator Ciccone to add his voice to what's going on. Anyway, this inquiry has been dismissed by the Victorian senator as backward-looking and driven by nostalgia rather than genuine national security concerns. That's his view. Now, I don't regard that as being blistering at all. It's just a vague repetition of talking points, plus it's an opportunity to attack the Greens. Now, I'll read a couple of full paragraphs so people know exactly what I'm talking about. This is Ciccone. Let us be clear about what is at stake. Australia is an island trading nation with the third largest maritime domain in the world. Almost all of our trade travels by sea. Our fuel, food, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, manufactured goods, and many other essentials arrive through maritime supply chains. The very foundation of our economy and our capacity to defend ourselves depends on secure access to the sea. This is not an understatement. It's an existential vulnerability that any politician or commentator who dismisses the protection of Australia's maritime trade as insignificant or far worse, as ridiculous, is not just unserious about national security, they are negligent. And again, I repeat, for the senator and everyone else, no one is saying we don't need a navy. No one is saying that submarines are irrelevant. It's much more complex than that, and it involves budgets, emerging technologies, workforce issues, RAN recruiting, sovereignty, and a myriad of other considerations. I'll again just read a bit more from the senator. Let us be clear about the capability that we are acquiring. Only 6 countries in the world operate nuclear-powered submarines: the United States, the UK, France, Russia, China, and India. By acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, Australia is recognising the security of our nation deserves and demands capability equal to the most powerful nations of the world. Developing such critical but exclusive capability was always going to demand patience, determination, and commitment. Neither Australia nor our partners in the US and the United Kingdom have wavered on this commitment. Now, think about that for a moment. What the senator is actually saying is that acquiring nuclear-powered submarines is just a giant vanity project. We want to be operating something on the same level as those much larger, much more capable countries. And by the way, all of them, all 6, have big ballistic missile firing SSBNs to protect. That's what you need SSNs to do. Australia doesn't have ballistic missile firing submarines. Now, all of those countries, as I say, they have much larger economies than Australia, and they also have existing nuclear industries. I've run out of time. I did want to say a few words about the US switching off Anthropic software for a while. I'll do that next time. It's a further vulnerability for Australia. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
Vantor delivers sovereign spatial intelligence so nations can own the ground truth. See how at vantor.com.